I never thought of myself as the kind of guy who'd end up in a mess like this. My name is Daniel, and I'm 38 years old. For the past 10 years, I've been married to Laura, a stunning woman with an infectious laugh and a charm that always turned heads. We met in college, where she was studying marketing, and I was on my way to becoming a civil engineer. We were the classic power couple, ambitious, driven, and madly in love, or at least, that's how it used to be. We both landed decent jobs after graduation. I ended up working with a construction firm downtown, overseeing projects that shaped the skyline of our city. Laura, on the other hand, found her niche in advertising. She quickly climbed the ranks, landing a managerial position at a prestigious firm. Our lives seemed perfect from the outside. We had the house in the suburbs, the cars, the vacations, everything two people could want except children. We had tried for a while, but when it didn't happen, we decided to stop stressing over it and enjoy our lives as they were. But as time went on, I started to feel a distance growing between us. Laura was always busy, always on her phone or laptop, working late, and often going on business trips. At first, I chalked it up to the demands of her job. I was busy too. Construction deadlines are relentless, and my career was taking off. I figured we were just in a busy phase of life, that it was normal for married couples to drift in and out of sync. But some things didn't add up. Laura's behavior started to change subtly but unmistakably. She was more guarded with her phone, locking it with a new password she didn't share. She'd go for late-night drives to clear her head, or disappear on weekends for work retreats. Our conversations became shallow, revolving around what to have for dinner or the latest project at work. Intimacy dwindled to the occasional obligatory SX, more like a chore than an expression of love. It was as if the warmth that once connected us had been replaced by something cold and distant. I would often find myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where we went wrong. But every time I tried to talk about it, she'd brush me off with a tired sigh or an irritated glance, saying I was just being paranoid or insecure. Despite my suspicions, I didn't want to believe that Laura could be unfaithful. We had built so much together. Surely we could get through whatever this was. I told myself that I was overreacting, that it was just a rough patch. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I noticed her clothes smelled different, like a cologne I didn't recognize. And then there were the phone calls, quick, whispered conversations that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. One night, I found myself flipping through old photo albums, trying to remind myself of the good times. There were pictures of us hiking, laughing at parties, and celebrating anniversaries. But looking at those photos felt like staring at strangers. The smiles seemed forced, the joy distant. I couldn't pinpoint when it all changed, but I knew it was different now. The Laura in those photos wasn't the Laura who stood before me today. And maybe, just maybe, the Daniel she married wasn't the same either. I decided I needed to figure out what was going on. I couldn't live in the uncertainty any longer, with this gnawing sense of betrayal eating away at me. I had no idea what I was going to find, but I knew I needed to find something, anything, to explain why our marriage felt like a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. And so I started paying closer attention, watching for signs, piecing together the puzzle that was my wife. I hoped I was wrong, that all this suspicion was just the result of too much stress and not enough sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was lurking just out of sight, waiting to tear my world apart. As the days dragged on, I found myself consumed by thoughts of Laura and her increasingly erratic behavior. Every time she left the house, I wondered where she was really going. I started noticing the little things, like the way she'd smile at her phone, her fingers flying across the screen in rapid texts. She'd slip away to take calls, her voice dropping to a whisper as soon as she thought I was out of earshot. It was like she was living a double life, and I was just the idiot husband on the outside, piecing together scraps of a puzzle I wasn't meant to solve. At work, I was distracted, and it showed. My boss called me into his office one afternoon, expressing concern about my performance. I was a project manager. I needed to be on my game. But lately, my mind was anywhere but on blueprints and deadlines. I reassured him that everything was fine, just a rough patch at home, but even as I said it, I knew I was lying. Everything was far from fine. Laura's excuses became more frequent and more elaborate. Late. Meeting, don't wait up, she'd text, or client dinner might be back late. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but my gut told me something was off. One night, she came home at 2 a.m., her hair disheveled, her makeup smudged in a way that didn't scream work dinner. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV, but really just waiting for her. She looked startled when she saw me, her expression quickly shifting to annoyance. "Why are you still up?" she snapped, kicking off her heels by the door. "Late meeting, huh?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, a very late meeting," she said, heading straight for the bedroom without another word. She didn't even look at me. I sat there, staring at the blank TV screen, feeling like a fool. I knew I couldn't keep playing dumb. I needed proof, something concrete that I could confront her with. I started checking her social media, scanning through her posts and likes, looking for anything that might explain her behavior. But everything looked normal, too normal. Perfectly curated shots of work events, lunches with friends, and sunsets captioned with motivational quotes. There was no sign of the Laura I saw slipping away into the night, no hint of the secrets she was keeping. But then there was this one post, a photo of her at a cafe I didn't recognize, with a group of people I'd never met. It was a harmless enough picture, but in the corner of the frame, just barely in view, was a man I didn't know. His face was partially obscured, but the way Laura was leaning towards him, the way her eyes sparkled, it set off alarms in my head. I decided to dig deeper. I checked her credit card statements when she wasn't looking, skimming through charges for dinners and boutique purchases I didn't recognize. One charge stood out, a high-end hotel downtown, booked on a night she claimed to be out of town on business. My heart sank. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. I wanted to confront her then and there, but I knew she'd just lie her way out of it. I needed to be sure, to see it with my own eyes. So, I started following her, casually at first, but then more deliberately. I'd leave work early, saying I had appointments or meetings, and I'd trail her car from a distance. It felt dirty and wrong, like I was the one betraying her. But I couldn't stop. I was desperate for answers, for anything that would confirm what I already knew in my heart. And then, one evening, it happened. I was driving home when I saw her car parked outside a small cafe on a quiet street. It wasn't the kind of place she'd usually go, not for work or for fun. I pulled over, turning off my headlights, and watched from across the street. My pulse quickened as I scanned the cafe windows, searching for her familiar face. And there she was, sitting at a table near the back, laughing and leaning close to that same man from the photo. He was leaning in too, their heads almost touching as they talked. I felt a rush of anger, of betrayal so intense it nearly took my breath away. But I couldn't look away. I had to see more, to know the full extent of her lies. What I saw next made my blood run cold. She slipped off her heels under the table, her bare foot slowly creeping towards him. He glanced around, then leaned back, a smug smile playing on his lips. Laura's foot found its mark, rubbing against him under the table as he closed his eyes and sighed, clearly enjoying it. My stomach churned, and I felt like I might be sick right there in my car. This wasn't just a fling. This was something deliberate, something that went beyond a momentary lapse in judgment. I couldn't watch anymore. I started the car and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. My thoughts raced, a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a burning desire for revenge. I had seen enough. Laura had made her choice, and now it was my turn. My revenge would be swift, and it would be ruthless. She would pay for every lie, every whispered phone call, and every night spent with him instead of me. And she would never see it coming. The drive home felt like an eternity, my mind a chaotic storm of emotions. I could barely see the road through the blur of my anger. Every red light was another second ticking by, another reminder that Laura was still there with him, touching him in ways she hadn't touched me in months. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and the image of her bare foot teasing him under the table played on an endless loop in my mind. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I didn't get out right away. I just sat there, staring at the darkened windows of our house. Our house. The place where we were supposed to be building a life together, not tearing it apart with secrets and lies. I clenched my jaw, trying to rein in the anger boiling inside me. I wasn't going to confront her tonight. No, that would be too easy. I needed a plan, something that would hit her where it hurt the most. I spent the next few days acting normal, or as close to normal as I could manage. I went through the motions of work, of life, pretending that everything was fine. But inside, I was a wreck, torn between the urge to scream at her and the need to keep my cool. I kept my distance, watching her closely without making it obvious. Every time she left the house, I noted the time, the direction she drove, the clothes she wore. I felt like a detective on the verge of cracking a case. But this wasn't just any case. This was my life unraveling before my eyes. One evening, I got home early, hoping to catch her before she disappeared again. Laura was in the kitchen, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked so damn ordinary, like nothing was out of place, like she hadn't just been out rubbing her feet on some guy's crotch under a table. She greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, stirring something on the stove. I watched her for a moment, trying to see if there was any hint of guilt or regret. But there was nothing, just the same blank expression she'd been giving me for weeks. "Busy," I replied, my voice tight. "You?" "Same," she said with a shrug. "Just work. You know how it is." Yeah, I knew exactly how it was. I watched her pour herself a glass of wine, her movements calm and practiced. She sipped it slowly, her gaze drifting to the window as if lost in thought. For a brief moment, I wondered if she ever thought of me during those stolen moments with him. Did she feel any remorse, any guilt for what she was doing to us? But looking at her now, so composed and indifferent, I doubted it. A few days later, I followed her again, this time to a hotel downtown, the same one from the credit card statement. I parked a few blocks away and waited, watching as she and her lover walked up to the entrance, laughing and holding hands like carefree teenagers. It was surreal, like I was watching a bad movie where everything is too obvious, too predictable. They checked in, and I waited until they disappeared inside before I made my move. I approached the front desk, my heart pounding. The receptionist barely looked up as I casually asked for a room, pretending to be just another business traveler. I asked for a room on the same floor, and to my relief, they had one available. As I rode the elevator up, I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. This was it, the moment where I'd finally see just how far she was willing to go. When I got to their floor, I paced the hallway, listening at each door until I heard the unmistakable sound of muffled voices and laughter. It was them, just a few doors down. I stood there for a moment, staring at the number on the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Should I knock? Burst in and catch them in the act? Or should I wait, let them have their fun, and confront her later when she couldn't deny it? My hands trembled as I considered my options, each one more volatile than the last. But then, through the thin walls, I heard something that shattered whatever restraint I had left. It was Laura's voice, breathless and soft, saying his name over and over. The sound of the bed creaking, of sheets rustling, of two people lost in each other. I pressed my ear closer, straining to hear every sordid detail, every gasp and moan. She was fucking him, right there on the other side of the door, and she didn't care who knew it. I backed away, feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't some fling or a mistake she could apologize for. This was deliberate, calculated, and completely devoid of any respect for me or our marriage. I staggered back to the elevator, my legs barely able to support me as I leaned against the wall. My mind was a blur, the sounds of their betrayal echoing in my ears. I hit the button for the lobby and closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but it was no use. The image of Laura in bed with him was burned into my mind, a permanent scar I'd never be able to erase. As the elevator doors opened, I stepped out into the lobby, feeling a numbness creeping over me. I didn't care who saw me or what they thought. All I knew was that my marriage was over, and any semblance of the life I thought I had was gone. I walked out of the hotel and into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. There was no turning back now. Laura had made her choice, and I had seen the ugly truth with my own eyes. It was time to make my move, to take control of the situation. I wasn't going to sit back and let her walk all over me. She wanted to play games, to sneak around, and fuck some other guy behind my back? Fine. But I wasn't going to be the one left picking up the pieces. No, this time, she would be the one to suffer the consequences. My revenge was coming, and it would be swift and merciless. I spent the next few days in a haze, my mind constantly replaying that night at the hotel. The sounds of their laughter, the sight of them together, it was like a poison, spreading through me, tainting every thought and memory I had of Laura. I couldn't stand being in the house, surrounded by photos of us smiling, of the life we had supposedly built together. Everything felt like a lie, a cruel joke at my expense. I knew I needed to act quickly. The rage inside me was growing, pushing me towards a breaking point. Laura was still oblivious, going about her days with the same casual disregard, as if nothing had changed. She'd come home late, toss her bag on the couch, and head straight to the shower, never once pausing to ask how I was doing, where I was, or why I seemed so distant. It was like she had already checked out of our marriage, her mind and body completely devoted to that other man. But I was done being the clueless husband. I was done playing the fool. I started planning my revenge, meticulously going over every detail in my head. Laura had underestimated me, thinking she could keep her little secret without any repercussions. She thought I was weak, that I'd just accept whatever scraps of attention she threw my way. But she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I began by gathering evidence. I went through her emails, her text messages, and every hidden folder on her laptop. It wasn't hard to find the dirt. She hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks. There were love notes disguised as work emails, photos of them together in places she'd never mentioned visiting, and even a separate bank account she had opened to fund her secret life with him. Every discovery was like a knife to the heart, but I kept digging, driven by the need to see just how deep her betrayal went. Once I had everything I needed, I set my plan in motion. I wasn't going to confront her directly. That would be too easy, and Laura would just deny everything or try to twist it in her favor. No, I wanted her to feel the same humiliation, the same sense of powerlessness that I had felt. I wanted her to know that she wasn't as clever as she thought, that I had been 2 steps ahead of her the whole time. I called in a few favors from some contacts I had in IT. They owed me from past projects, and they were more than willing to help when I explained what was going on. With their help, I managed to get access to Laura's lover's personal details, his work address, his home, even his car registration. It was almost too easy. I had to stop myself from laughing at how sloppy they had both been, like they were teenagers sneaking around behind their parents' backs. I spent the next few nights setting up surveillance, hidden cameras, tracking devices, the works. I wanted a complete picture of every moment they spent together, every sordid detail laid bare. The footage started coming in almost immediately. I watched as Laura and her lover met in secluded spots, holding hands and whispering sweet nothings as if they were in some kind of twisted fairy tale. I watched them in restaurants, in his car, and even once in a park, where she kissed him like I hadn't seen her kiss me in years. It was sickening, but it was exactly what I needed. With everything in place, I began the next phase of my plan. I started by leaking just enough information to shake things up. A suggestive photo sent anonymously to her work email, a printout of their hotel reservation slipped under her office door. I watched her reaction closely. At first, she seemed annoyed, brushing it off as a prank or some kind of mistake. But as the messages became more frequent, more personal, I saw the panic start to set in. She became jumpy, checking her phone every few minutes, her eyes darting around as if expecting to see her lover pop out from behind every corner. One night, she came home in a foul mood, slamming the door and throwing her bag down with a force that startled me. She barely looked at me, her face flushed with anger. "Everything okay?" I asked, playing the concerned husband to perfection. "Fine," she snapped, then paused, glancing at me suspiciously. "Have you noticed anything weird lately? Like, have you gotten any strange messages or calls?" I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "No, why?" She hesitated, biting her lip as if debating whether to say more. "I don't know, just weird stuff happening at work. Probably nothing." I watched her closely, enjoying the slight tremor in her voice, the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. She was rattled, and she didn't know why. It was a small victory, but it felt good. She was starting to feel the pressure, and I was just getting started. I continued to drip feed her bits of information, just enough to keep her on edge. Anonymous texts, emails with vague threats, reminders that someone was always watching. I knew she'd be too scared to go to the police. What could she say? That her secret affair was being exposed by someone who knew every intimate detail? She was trapped, and every day I tightened the noose a little more. But the real masterpiece was yet to come. I had one final card to play, one that would turn her entire world upside down. I was going to expose her for what she was, not just to me, but to everyone she thought she could deceive. She had built her life on lies, and I was going to burn it all to the ground. There would be no escape, no excuses, and no way to deny what she had done. Laura had no idea what was coming, but she would soon enough. And when she did, she would realize that I wasn't the fool she had taken me for. The reckoning was at hand, and I was going to savor every moment of it. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than I had expected. Laura was still skittish, glancing over her shoulder like a hunted animal. Her nerves were fraying, and it was only a matter of time before she cracked. I watched her closely, my calm exterior hiding the storm of emotions brewing inside me. The footage I'd collected had painted a clear picture. Laura was in deep with this guy. It wasn't just SX. There was a twisted intimacy between them, a connection that once belonged to us. And that made it all the more satisfying to know that I was about to tear it all apart. I had spent hours meticulously compiling the evidence. Photos, videos, text conversations, bank statements. Everything was laid out in a neat, damning package that left no room for doubt. I created a presentation so thorough and undeniable that even the most silver-tongued lawyer couldn't spin it in her favor. And then, I sent it. Not to Laura. No, that would have been too simple. I sent it to her boss, her colleagues, her parents, and, just for good measure, to the lover's wife. If Laura was going to play dirty, then so would I. And I'd make sure the fallout was as public as possible. It didn't take long for the fireworks to start. I was at work when I got the first call from Laura's office. I ignored it, letting it go to voicemail. Then came another and another. My phone buzzed incessantly, notifications piling up as texts and emails flooded in. I could picture the chaos unfolding in her office. The whispers behind her back, the shocked gasps as people opened the files I had so carefully compiled. She had built her career on being the picture-perfect professional, but now everyone knew the truth. Laura was a cheat, a liar, and a fraud, and she couldn't hide from it anymore. By the time I got home, the house was eerily quiet. Laura's car was in the driveway, but the lights were off. I walked in, half expecting to find her in a rage, demanding answers. Instead, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone. She looked up as I entered, her face pale and drawn, eyes red from what I could only assume were hours of crying. "You," she started, her voice cracking. "You did this, didn't you?" I didn't bother denying it. I just leaned against the doorway, crossing my arms as I watched her squirm. "I don't know what you're talking about, Laura." "Don't play dumb with me," she snapped, slamming her phone on the table. "My boss called me into his office today. He showed me everything, Daniel. Pictures, videos, God, they all know. Everyone knows. How could you do this to me?" I laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed through the empty room. "How could I do this to you? How could you do this to me, Laura? To us? I wasn't the one sneaking around, fucking someone else behind your back." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. For a moment I saw a flicker of the old Laura, the one who could charm her way out of anything. But that flicker died quickly, replaced by a look of pure desperation. She was scrambling, trying to find a foothold in the mess she had created, but there was no escape. "Daniel, please," she said, her tone softening as she reached out a hand. "I'm sorry, okay? I screwed up, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, or take some time apart, or—" I cut her off with a sharp gesture, stepping forward as my anger surged to the surface. "Fix this? You think this is something we can fix? You've been screwing around with some guy like I wouldn't find out, like I'm just some idiot you can play. This isn't just some mistake, Laura. You've been lying to me for months and you didn't give a damn about what it would do to us." She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, silencing her. "You didn't just cheat on me, you betrayed me. You betrayed everything we built together. And now you want to talk about fixing things? It's too late for that." She stared at me, her eyes wide and wet, and for a brief moment I thought she might break down completely. But then, she squared her shoulders, her expression hardening as she wiped away the tears. "You're not blameless, Daniel. You've been distant for months, buried in your work, barely looking at me. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, I wouldn't have felt so alone." I laughed again, louder this time. "Oh, so this is my fault now?" Classic Laura, always deflecting, always trying to make it about someone else. But let's get one thing straight. I may have been distant, but I never once strayed. I never once made you feel like you weren't enough. That was all you. You chose this. You chose him." Her face twisted in anger, but I could see the cracks forming, the realization that she couldn't spin this in her favor. Not this time. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? That you're the victim in all of this. But you're not. You're just as flawed as I am, and this isn't justice. This is you being vindictive." "Maybe it is," I said, leaning in close. "But it feels pretty damn good. And you know what? I'm not done yet." I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the dimly lit kitchen, surrounded by the ruins of the life she had so carelessly destroyed. I felt no sympathy, no pangs of regret. Laura had played her game and she had lost. She had lied, cheated, and thought she could get away with it. But she hadn't counted on me fighting back, on me making sure that her betrayal would be known to everyone she held dear. This was just the beginning. Laura had gotten a taste of what was coming, but there was more. So much more. And I wasn't going to stop until she felt every ounce of the pain she had inflicted on me. She had no one to blame but herself, and I was going to enjoy watching her world burn to the ground. The aftermath of Laura's exposure was nothing short of a spectacle. Word spread quickly through her office. and I could only imagine the whispers and side glances she endured every time she walked down the hallway. Her once flawless reputation was now tainted, her carefully crafted image crumbling under the weight of her indiscretions. She was the talk of the company, not for her sharp strategies or her impressive pitches, but for the scandal that now defined her. I heard from a mutual friend that Laura had been called into a meeting with the higher-ups. It was a closed-door discussion, the kind that usually ends with someone clearing out their desk. She didn't lose her job that day, but she might as well have. Her position was compromised, and everyone knew she was on borrowed time. They demoted her, stripping her of her managerial status and assigning her to a junior role under some up-and-comer half her age. The humiliation was public and deliberate, a clear message from the company that they wouldn't tolerate her behavior. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. She came home that night, her eyes hollow and dark, the once fiery spark now dulled by shame. She didn't say a word as she passed me in the hallway, heading straight for the bedroom without even a glance in my direction. I watched her go, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and a strange, unexpected pity. For years, we had been partners in everything, and now we were little more than strangers, trapped in the same space but living in completely different worlds. It didn't take long for the fallout to extend beyond the workplace. Laura's family, always so proud of their successful daughter, were mortified when the news reached them. Her mother called, her voice strained with disappointment as she demanded answers, asked why Laura had thrown everything away. I could hear the conversation from the next room, Laura's muffled sobs as she tried to explain, to justify her actions. But there was no justification that could make sense of what she'd done. She tried to reach out to her lover, her voice desperate and pleading when she thought I wasn't listening. But he didn't pick up. He had problems of his own now, thanks to the package I sent to his wife. The last I heard, she was filing for divorce, kicking him out of the house and taking him for everything he was worth. It seemed poetic in a way, the perfect parallel to the mess Laura and I were now entangled in. He had been just as careless, just as selfish, and now he was reaping the rewards of his deceit. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome if I'd tried. Laura was left with nothing but her guilt and the shattered remnants of her double life. She tried to act like everything was fine, like she was handling it all with grace, but the cracks were there for anyone to see. She was crumbling under the weight of it all, every new piece of gossip, every sideways glance a reminder of how far she had fallen. She stopped going out as much, withdrawing into herself as if that would somehow shield her from the consequences. But the walls were closing in, and there was no hiding from the mess she'd made. Meanwhile, I was already planning my next move. I wasn't satisfied with just tearing down her professional and personal life. I wanted her to feel the full impact of her actions on every level. I started reaching out to mutual friends, casually slipping in details about what had happened, painting a vivid picture of her betrayal without ever needing to exaggerate. I knew how people would react, shocked at first, then slowly turning away from her, as if her betrayal was contagious. She had built her social circle on the pretense of being the perfect wife and successful career woman, and now all of that was tainted. I watched as her phone calls and texts went unanswered, her friends gradually distancing themselves. It was a slow, painful process, like watching someone sink in quicksand. She was desperate for someone to confide in, someone who would listen without judgment, but those people were becoming fewer and further between. She tried reaching out to me once, in a moment of vulnerability, but I shut it down before she could even start. There was no sympathy left in me, no desire to be her shoulder to cry on after everything she had done. Then came the financial blow. The separate bank account I had discovered was the key to unraveling her independence. With the help of my lawyer, I froze her assets, making it impossible for her to access the funds she had hidden away. I watched her frustration mount as she tried and failed to make sense of why her money was suddenly out of reach. Her lavish spending habits came to a grinding halt, replaced by frantic calls to the bank and desperate pleas for answers. I had locked her out of her own safety net, and she had no one to blame but herself. She confronted me one night, her voice shaking with anger and desperation. "You froze my account, didn't you? This is low, even for you, Daniel." I leaned back in my chair, meeting her glare with a calm indifference that only seemed to infuriate her more. "I don't know what you're talking about, Laura. Maybe your lover maxed it out. You know, affairs can get expensive." "Don't play games with me," she screamed, slamming her fist on the table. "You're doing everything you can to ruin me, and for what? To prove a point? To feel like a big man? Well, congratulations, Daniel. You've done it. You've destroyed everything." I stood up slowly, closing the distance between us. "You destroyed it, Laura. You and your lies, your cheating, your complete disregard for anyone but yourself. I'm just making sure you feel what I felt. Betrayed, humiliated, and utterly alone." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was too far gone, buried under the consequences of her actions, and there was no digging her way out. I watched her deflate, the fight draining out of her as she slumped into a chair, her head in her hands. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, almost wanted to reach out and offer some semblance of comfort. But then I remembered the cafe, the hotel, the countless lies, and that sympathy vanished as quickly as it had come. Laura was paying for her sins, and I wasn't about to let up. Not yet. She needed to learn that actions have consequences, that every choice has a price. And I was more than willing to collect. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house grew unbearable. Laura was a shell of her former self, drifting through the rooms like a ghost. The once vibrant woman who filled every space with her energy was now hollowed out, weighed down by the wreckage of her own making. She spent most of her time locked away in the bedroom, curtains drawn tight as if trying to block out the world. I could hear her muffled sobs at night, the sound barely audible through the thick walls. There was no more pretense, no more facade of strength. She was unraveling, and it was exactly what I wanted. The house, which used to be a place of laughter and shared dreams, now felt like a battlefield littered with the debris of our shattered marriage. We moved around each other in silence, barely acknowledging the other's presence. It was as if we were strangers occupying the same space, each day a reminder of how far we had fallen. I found solace in the quiet, in the knowledge that Laura's suffering was a direct result of her choices. But at the same time, there was a gnawing emptiness, a hollow victory that left me feeling more lost than ever. One evening I came home to find her sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by old photo albums. She was flipping through the pages, her fingers lingering over pictures of us from better times, our wedding day, vacations, anniversaries, moments that once meant everything, now reduced to painful reminders of a life we no longer had. She didn't look up as I entered the room, her focus entirely on the images before her. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. She glanced up, her eyes puffy and red. "Just looking," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I was trying to remember when we were happy." I watched her for a moment, feeling a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Sadness? I wasn't sure, but I pushed it down, refusing to let it take root. This wasn't the time for nostalgia. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. "Those days are gone, Laura," I said flatly. "You killed them." She flinched at my words, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I messed up. But Daniel, I'm sorry. I never wanted it to end like this." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe as I looked down at her. "It's a little late for apologies, don't you think? You had plenty of chances to make things right. But you chose him. You chose this." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I just want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." I turned away, not trusting myself to respond. Her apology was meaningless to me now. It was a drop of water in an ocean of betrayal. Far too little. Far too late. I left her there, alone with her memories, and went to the kitchen to pour myself a drink. I needed something to dull the edges, to take the sting out of the reality we were living. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of it all pressed down on me. The silence was deafening, filled with unspoken words and unresolved pain. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of everything that had happened, every choice that had led us to this point. Laura's affair had shattered my trust, broken my heart, and upended the life we'd built together. But my revenge, as satisfying as it was in the moment, hadn't brought me the closure I'd hoped for. If anything, it had only deepened the void between us. The next morning, Laura was up before me, a rare occurrence in recent weeks. I found her in the kitchen, staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes. She had barely touched her breakfast, her coffee sitting untouched on the counter. I poured myself a cup, watching her from the corner of my eye. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was about to break. She finally turned to me, her expression a mix of exhaustion and resignation. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice steady but brittle. I took a sip of my coffee, nodding. "Yeah, I think so too." We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals and conversations over the years. But now, it felt like a negotiation, the air thick with tension and unspoken truths. Laura fidgeted with her hands, her gaze fixed on the table as she struggled to find the right words. "I can't do this anymore," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep living like this, with you hating me, and me hating myself. It's tearing me apart, Daniel. I don't expect you to take me back, but I can't stay here knowing what I've done. It's killing me." I listened, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something else, something that felt like the faintest glimmer of understanding. As much as I hated her for what she'd done, I couldn't deny that we were both trapped in a cycle of pain that was slowly consuming us. "What do you want, Laura?" I asked, my tone softer than before. "What do you think will fix this?" She looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just know I can't keep living like this. I need a fresh start. Away from here, away from everything that reminds me of how badly I screwed up." I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. "A fresh start," I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "And where does that leave us? Are we just supposed to pretend like none of this happened?" She shook her head, her expression pained. "No, we can't pretend, but maybe we can try to move on, for both our sakes." I nodded slowly, the reality of her words sinking in. We had reached a breaking point, and there was no going back. The damage was done, the wounds too deep to heal. Laura was right. We couldn't keep living like this. The best we could do was to go our separate ways and try to salvage whatever was left of our broken lives. As I watched her pack a suitcase later that day, I felt a strange sense of finality. This was the end of us, the end of everything we had once believed in. But maybe, in that ending, there was a sliver of hope. A chance for both of us to find a way forward, even if it meant doing so apart. Laura paused at the door, her suitcase in hand. She glanced back at me one last time, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and longing. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said softly. "Goodbye, Laura," I replied, watching as she walked out of our home and out of my life. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and for the first time in a long while, the house was truly silent. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty seat across from me. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the revenge. It was all over, and as I sat there, alone with my thoughts, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we both deserved a second chance. Not with each other, but with ourselves. After Laura left, the silence in the house was overwhelming. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways, her slamming the door, shouting obscenities, or begging me to reconsider. But there was none of that. Just a quiet departure, as if we were two strangers parting ways after a fleeting, inconsequential encounter. I sat at the kitchen table long after she had gone, staring at the empty seat where she used to sit, her presence now just a ghost in the corners of my mind. I thought I would feel triumphant, like I had won some grand battle, but instead all I felt was an emptiness that gnawed at my insides. Revenge had given me a fleeting satisfaction, but it hadn't brought the peace I was so desperately seeking. If anything, it left me feeling more hollow than before. I had been so consumed with making Laura pay that I hadn't stopped to think about what came next, what came after the dust settled, and I was left alone in the wreckage of our lives. The days that followed were a blur. I returned to work, diving into projects with a single-minded focus that bordered on obsessive. My colleagues noticed the change, but no one asked questions. I suppose they could see the strain in my eyes, the way I moved with a deliberate detachment, as if I was going through the motions without truly engaging. I was grateful for their silence. I didn't have the energy to explain, and honestly, I wasn't even sure I could. Nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed, staring at the empty space beside me, the sheets cold and undisturbed. The house creaked and groaned, the sounds amplified in the stillness. Every creak felt like a reminder of what was missing, of the life that had once filled these walls with warmth and laughter. I found myself reaching out, as if expecting to feel Laura's familiar presence beside me, only to be met with the stark reality of her absence. I tried to distract myself in any way I could. I threw myself into home improvement projects, tackling long-neglected repairs and renovations with a fervor that bordered on manic. I repainted the living room, replaced the old, worn-out carpets, and rearranged the furniture. It was a futile attempt to make the house feel new, to strip away the memories of a life that no longer existed. But no matter how many changes I made, the truth was always there, lurking in the corners like a stubborn stain that refused to be scrubbed away. One night, after a particularly grueling day at work, I found myself standing in the doorway of what used to be Laura's office. The room was still filled with her things, books, knickknacks, and framed photos that had once decorated her desk. I hadn't touched any of it since she left, as if doing so would somehow solidify the reality that she was gone for good. But now, with the quiet pressing in around me, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of her perfume that still clung to the walls. I picked up a photo frame from her desk, a picture of us from our first anniversary, grinning like fools at the camera, our faces flushed with the glow of new love. We looked so happy, so full of hope and promise. I traced my finger over the glass, feeling a pang of loss that cut deeper than I expected. I set the frame back down, my hand lingering for a moment, as if trying to hold on to the past. I spent hours in that room, sorting through her belongings with a strange sense of detachment. There were letters, receipts, and mementos from trips we had taken together. Each item was a reminder of the life we had once shared, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. I boxed up everything that was hers, sealing away the remnants of our marriage like a time capsule that I would never open again. As I packed away the last of her things, I came across a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a drawer. It was Laura's handwriting, the pages filled with her thoughts and musings from the past few years. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the worn cover as I debated whether to read it. Part of me felt like it would be an invasion of her privacy, a final betrayal in a long list of betrayals. But another part of me, a part driven by a need to understand, couldn't resist. I opened the journal, flipping through the pages with a mix of curiosity and dread. Her words were raw and unfiltered, a window into the mind of a woman who had been struggling long before the affair ever began. She wrote about feeling lost, about the growing distance between us, and the overwhelming sense of failure that had crept into every aspect of her life. It was painful to read, each entry a testament to the cracks that had been widening beneath the surface of our marriage while I remained blissfully unaware. One passage caught my attention, dated a few months before everything came crashing down. I don't know who I am anymore. I used to be so sure of everything, my career, my marriage, my future. But now it all feels like a lie. I feel trapped in this life that I don't recognize, with a husband who barely sees me anymore. I know it's not his fault. We've both changed, grown apart in ways I never imagined. But I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when I'm dying inside. I just wish I knew how to fix it. I wish I knew how to be happy again. I closed the journal, my hands trembling as I set it aside. Laura's words lingered in my mind, echoing the same sentiments I had felt, but never voiced. We had both been lost, searching for something we couldn't find in each other. I had been so focused on punishing her, on making her pay for her betrayal, that I hadn't stopped to consider the pain she had been carrying all along. It didn't excuse what she did, but it gave me a new perspective, one that was harder to ignore. For the first time since she left, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the marriage that had ended, but for the people we used to be. I sat on the floor of her empty office, the boxes stacked around me, and let the tears come. They were tears of anger, of sadness, and of a deep, aching regret that I couldn't shake. I had lost Laura long before she ever crossed that line, and I had been too blind to see it. The next morning, I loaded her belongings into the car and drove them to a storage unit on the other side of town. It felt like closing a chapter, one that I wasn't ready to revisit anytime soon. I locked the unit, pocketing the key with a sense of finality. This was it. The end of us. The end of everything we had once known. As I drove home, I thought about the fresh start Laura had talked about, the need to move on from the mess we had made. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time for both of us to let go of the past and figure out what came next. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough.